Where and when were you born?
I was born in Libya.
Oh.
My father was in the army, and during the war he'd been fighting in Burma against the Japanese. And so after the war, my mother married him and joined him in India, and they got sent to Japan, along with the British forces that had been fighting in Burma, and they were the first to go into Japan before the Americans colonized that land. At which point my father was then sent to Singapore and from there to Libya. So essentially he was on his way back to Britain, but slowly. And so I spent my first 18 months in Libya, living on the shores of the Mediterranean. I don't remember it, but I'd love to go back sometime if I can.
Yes.
Unfortunately, it's a bit of a war zone at the moment, so that's not possible.
Absolutely. I'm interested in people's astrological sign. What is yours?
Oh, I'm Aries Sun sign.
Uh-huh. And do you relate to that? Does it, do you feel like an Aries person?
Oh, very much so, yes. Always ahead of the time.
Ah. You know, they say that there's Aries that are like a lamb and Aries like a ram. Which category would you fall into?
I think I'm like a ewe.
Excellent. And what's your birth order?
What's my what?
Birth order in terms of siblings in your family.
Oh, I have an elder brother.
So you're two of two.
He was born in Japan.
Uh-huh. And have you had a chance to take the Kiersey Bates, the Myers-Briggs personality?
I'm sorry, I do apologise, I haven't got round to that. But I did do the Myers-Briggs way back when I was doing my Ph.D. And if my memory serves me correctly, is there one of the categories is something like feeling perception?
The way it goes is extrovert, introvert. What's your guess? And then it'll be interesting to take.
I'm almost certainly extrovert.
Yeah. And then the next category is intuitive sensing.
That sounds like the feeling perception one. Is that the same?
No. Then the third one is thinking, feeling. And the last one is perceiving, judging, which aren't accurate words.
Then I've forgotten.
Okay.
It's too long ago.
Not surprising. I'm getting really very significant results, so I'm eager to have another data point added to the Myers-Briggs. So you've lived, you've taught in India, of course, the UK, Tibet, Japan, the US. Do you find that you teach differently? I know I certainly did when I taught my energy tools workshops in Japan. But are there different approaches, different characters that you find in different countries that you've worked in?
Well, number one, I've never taught in Tibet. I've worked with Tibetan monks in India.
Right.
So I taught, yes, I did teach some parapsychology to the younger monks when I was working in the monastery in South India. Of course, that's different because of translators. And the same in Japan. You know, when you're teaching with a translator, everything is much slower. And you've got to simplify everything because you want to get a certain amount of material across, but you've only got a certain length of time, and it's going to be half the time, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So that is very, very different teaching when you're working with a translator. Otherwise, yes, teaching in India, where I was teaching at the ashram at the Yoga University, that was in English, but most of the students were Indian. And I did find that their approach to the subject was very, very different.
How so?
So that meant that the teaching was very interesting.
How was their approach different? I know.
The Indian culture says that teacher is almost complete know-it-all and not to be questioned. And they have been taught to basically write down everything that you say, and rote learn it, so to speak. So I had to really encourage them to ask questions, to have dialogue, to have discussion. And there were 2 or 3 that readily took to it. And with those 2 or 3 that were able to go to a more Western style of teaching, it helped to make the class a bit more interesting. But the majority would still just sit there completely silently, writing down everything that you said.
Japan and China were like that too, in my experience. Because you study for the test, the college entrance exam test. So you've got to memorize the right information.
Yeah. Well, in Japan, I was teaching at a yoga center. And although I wasn't teaching yoga, they were all what I would call unusual adult students. And although I was with a translator, we were doing very interesting material. And so, yes, that I would have to present a body of stuff, but we did get lots of really good interaction and discussion going. So that was much more like a Western class, despite the fact of having to work with translator.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That was my experience in Japan too. Although at first they would, I'd say, questions, observations, comments, silence. So one time I just sat on the floor and said, okay, I'm going to meditate here in lotus until someone has a comment or a question. And then it just opened up. And from then on, there was like, they just needed permission to have a discussion in class. Yeah. What is a yoga university? This is the first one of its kind in the world?
I don't think it's the first one of its kind. I think that various different of the Swami lineages have done the equivalent of a yoga university of various forms. This was in Bihar, the Bihar School of Yoga that was started by Swami Satyananda Saraswati, and they applied to the Indian government to set up a university. So it was accredited with the Indian government. They did various levels of courses. I was teaching a 2-year postgraduate course. They had a 1-year diploma course, they had a 3-month certificate course, and this was the 2-year course. And I think it's still going. I only taught there for 3 years. But it was really interesting. It was like a hothouse of growth and development, because we were all within 10-foot high walls. The students were only allowed out 1 day a fortnight. So we all were very intensely together. And because you started with yogasanas at 5 o'clock in the morning, through to breakfast at 6, through to karma yoga for an hour, which was cleaning the whole ashram, through to ordinary classes, which then led on to meditation the hour before lunch, then a 2-hour break where most people did what was called seva or service, where they helped out in one department or another. Then more classes until... there'd be the tea break first, which was the only time you had any caffeine, the cup of tea. Then there would be another seva, and then there would be supper, and then there would be chanting, kirtan. And then you went to bed at 7, 8 o'clock to get up at 4 o'clock the next morning. And that was every day, apart from 1 day a week.
I can see that a lot of unconscious material would come up under that kind of intensity.
Yes, a lot. And I found, in terms of my personal development, it was a huge shift. Really huge, because although I was teaching my classes, I was also allowed to attend the students' classes. So I attended the yogasanas, the meditation, the kirtan, and a certain number of the yoga philosophy or yoga psychology or whatever classes I thought would be particularly interesting.
How would you say that you changed after that 3 years?
Oh, my personal practice, what they call sadhana. You know, it really, really gave a big kick up the arse and got me doing regular practice every morning without fail almost. And the type of practice that I was doing really developed enormously. And also the philosophy, the yoga philosophy. So, you know, they were teaching not only the Vedic scriptures, but also the Tantric scriptures. And that yoga philosophy informed my worldview enormously. And it changed the way in which I live my personal life. Because a lot of yoga is about your lifestyle. You know, actually the starting point of yoga is the yamas and the niyamas, the how you actually live your life. And so the way I live my life now has been informed to a great degree by those years in the ashram.
In that kind of discipline, were people experiencing cities where they were levitating or any other kinds of cities?
No, and definitely not encouraged. The Swami considered that sort of experience is something that happens, but is something that you just put down to experience and you go on with the practice. Because the goal, the aim is enlightenment. And there are sort of distractions along the way. But they're also teaching points. So that's why I was invited to teach parapsychology, because they considered it better to be informed than to be ignorant. And that in the siddhis occurring were some of your greatest spiritual tests. So about ego, about humility, about glamour, about karma, about all of this aspect, equanimity. All of this came in as part of your personal self-development, and the psychic stuff really tested you in those areas.
Interesting. Because I know, like, in Transcendental Meditation, they would have seminars where the aim was to levitate. So you see videos of them kind of bouncing off the ground.
Yes, well, this is very different.
Yes. What was your curriculum? When you say you teach parapsychology, what were you teaching? What books were you using?
I took over a basic library of books that I'd been using in my classes here in Britain, but very basic, because obviously I couldn't take over that much. But I did have a lending library for the students to be able to utilise. The SBR have a very basic cover of the range of parapsychology. There's a handbook of parapsychology, things like that. And we started off with history. So from mesmer through mediumistic stuff and on through to laboratory stuff, the basic Rhine paradigm of the forced choice with cards and stuff, and then on through to the 70s where you got the remote viewing type paradigm, and then all the work with altered states, and so on and so forth, ending up with things like looking at ghosts and poltergeists and out-of-body experiences and the more personal life experiences that people have. So it was a whole very short range. Short. Every little bit of parapsychology was dealt with at a very superficial level, very quickly, if you see what I mean. But it gave them the whole range. And with it, we did practical. Because they were postgraduate, I thought it was really important for them to do practical as well. So every bit of it, there was a little bit of practical as well as the theory. And then they were asked to do their own personal project. So, they would spend a month or so on their own personal project. And one of those projects really intrigued me. And so the second and third year, I got permission from the guru that I would actually do my own research with both the students and the swamis, that's the monks and the nuns. And this was what led to the research with the Tibetans.
And what was that student project that sparked you? How did you develop that?
So what the project was looking at Patanjali's Yoga Sutras teaching that as you attain to samadhi, so the siddhis manifest. And we didn't question the veracity of the teaching. What we questioned was, did it only happen at a certain point when you attain samadhi? Or was it something that you could see a bit by bit change as you did your practice over the years? And essentially, I mean, the research, when we were in the ashram, we were sort of developing the protocol, developing how to do it, working out what was the best way of asking this question and getting the answers. And a statistician from America joined me because I needed the help of a statistician to help with the design. And a friend of mine developed a computer program that we could use to do it, so it could all be in on a computer. And this, when it was fully developed, was what I then worked with the Tibetans. But the results from the ashram, which were obviously this preliminary development phase, suggested that it was a bit by bit change, that as you did your practice, slowly but surely the changes happened. And it was nothing to do with the asanas or to do with the pranayama. It was the years of practice of meditation that was the most important thing. So when we worked with the Tibetans, we only worked with the meditation. And once again, we got corroboration with 2 further experiments that what we'd found in the ashram was what was happening also with the Tibetans, that the years of practice are correlated to a very high degree with increasing awareness at the clairvoyant level. And
how did you measure their clairvoyance? And did you find people who had, in fact, reached samadhi, enlightenment?
I never got to work with anyone who I would say was enlightened, but I certainly had interviews with the most amazing Rinpoche, who I was only allowed to spend 20 minutes in his room at any one time, and I would walk out feeling as if I was floating on air because he just poured so much love into me. It was just the most brilliant experience. But I did work with some very experienced lamas who had done years of retreat and years of practice. So that was really a real blessing. It felt like a real blessing that I had been given to be able to work with these amazing people.
And what are examples of their heightened clairvoyant abilities, and how did you measure that?
Yeah, okay.
Anecdotal?
What we used a very basic free response design. So this was one where in the computer we had 100 pictures. And with the Tibetans, we used pictures of India and Tibet so that they were within their actual experience. And those were divided into 25 sets of 4. At random, the computer would choose one of those sets. The person would go into meditation with the aim that they would become aware of the picture that would be chosen by the computer at the end of the session.
So it's like Gans field.
Yeah, well, it's basic remote viewing, yes. At the end of their meditation, they would draw out their experience. So that's like remote viewing, where you just do drawing. The translator and I would join them. They would describe to the translator what it was they had experienced and what they had drawn. So all of that's on record. They would then see the 4 pictures. They would make their choice from the 4 pictures, 1, 2, 3, 4. But we did it on a rating, so they'd give 70%, 50%, 30%, whatever. And then they would get to see the actual picture. And the ones, the outstanding ones, let's call it that way, the people who've done 25, 30, 35 years of practice. I'll give you one example. So he had drawn a valley full of flowers. And the important thing for him was just these amazing flowers. And one of the pictures showed a rock pool with all of the lovely flora that you get in a rock pool. Now, he had never seen the sea. And when he saw that picture, he said, "What's that?" Because it was outside his experience. And my translator explained to him it was a rock pool, and these were the different sort of flowers and plants that you get in the rock pool. He said, "That's what I saw." He was absolutely clear. That's what I saw. Outside his experience, he described it as something from his experience, a valley full of flowers, but he knew immediately that that's what it related to. So I worked with some really amazing people.
What was the percentage? Usually they're like 27%, 30, 31% hit rate for those Gansfield 4-choice experiments. What were your percentages? I would expect they'd be higher with meditators like that.
Yeah. Okay, so when you're looking at an overall average, that's what you're getting, the 25 to 33%. So it's just above the chance level. But when we were working with people like that, we were much more into the 50 to 60%.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. It was wow.
How did you do in that when you did the remote viewing experiment?
I will always do it for. We had everybody do at least do 8 sessions. Because statistically, and also with the Tibetan teaching, you've got to repeat something at least 7 times in order to really know what it is that you're finding. And the Tibetans say the same, and the statisticians said we need to do 8 sessions to get a really clear idea of where this person is at. I would never do a full 8 sessions. I would just do a few sessions myself beforehand to make sure that everything was running properly and that I was well tuned into what they were going to be doing. So there were no statistics done on my, my experiences.
But I'm assuming that you had them, that you got the target.
On some occasions, but I have no idea what percentage. I think I found it very important for me to be completely neutral in that way. I know that I can pick up stuff. I always have done. So it's not that I was needed to test myself to see how good I was. That level, because I'm not anywhere close to enlightenment, that level of ego or whatever would be detrimental to the process that I was doing.
Got it. Especially it seems British researchers are interested in the correlation of psychology, personality type, and people who have psi abilities. And there's a personality type called schizoapathy, which I can never pronounce. Have you done any work with psi ability and personality type?
Well, when I was doing my Ph.D, I did a whole load of personality questionnaires along with that. I've always been more interested, yes, in the process. I did a psychology undergraduate degree, so I'm interested in what Granny Weatherwax calls headology. I do see that that's where the key thing happens. But I have to say that working in India, both with the yogis and with the Tibetans, I consider now that the most important aspect is culture and cultural beliefs. Because the Tibetans have the psychic as part and parcel of everyday life. Every monastery will have somebody who does divination. Every monastery will have an astrologer. Most of them will have a medium of what they call them oracles of some form or other. And you go around any of the Tibetan villages, nearly always there's a healer or a wise woman, and that will maybe be traditional in their family, and people will go to them. the monks who I was working with, they'd finished their 3-year retreat, and their job now was to go around the village and do rituals to help with healing, or somebody was possessed or whatever. It's just every day for them. There's not a problem. They have the problem with science. They consider that science destroys spirituality. So I found it very hard to get the older monks to work with me because they considered that doing science would be detrimental. Whereas the younger monks have grown up with the Dalai Lama saying we need to join science with spirituality, so they were quite happy to help me. The problem was they hadn't done much meditation. So, it was like, you win some, you lose some. But it was very interesting to me because here in the West, everybody is okay with the science. Most of them are not okay with the psychic stuff. And so it was a complete about turn. And I consider that Western culture is extremely detrimental to people having or acknowledging or being conscious of their psychic awareness.
And I think television and media has made it worse. Do you agree with that? Because it's the chatter all the time.
It's very interesting because there was one monk I worked with up in Ladakh. And Ladakh is right up high in the Himalayas. It's as remote from the Western world almost as you can get. And he had grown up in a very remote valley. And he was living in Leh, which is the capital of Ladakh. He was running a retreat centre there. And he agreed to work with me. And he said to me, I won't be able to do the level of psychic awareness that I would be able to do if I was living in my remote valley. There's too much interference here. There's televisions, there's cars, there's lots of people and chatter. Whereas in my remote valley, for 6 months of the year, you can't get in or out. You're basically stuck in your room because it's minus 40 outside. Then you would get the top psychic awareness from me. But here in the city, you will get far less. So that speaks to your point, and that's somebody who had experienced both.
That makes sense. Before we go more into your research, I'm interested in your childhood. What was there about your family that led you to get a Ph.D., in parapsychology, to be a researcher?
Okay, before I answer that question, I'm going to put another log on the fire.
Okay.
I'll be back in a second.
Okay. Stay tuned. We're just putting a log on the fire. Time to meditate. Go within.
Okay.
Thank you.
Back. Yeah, it was getting a bit low and I don't want it to go out completely.
No.
So you can see me again? Yeah, here I am. Yes, so my childhood. So my first, it was after, okay, I was born in Africa, but then we moved up to Austria and Germany to Scotland. And my dad's family is Scottish, and he was with the Scottish regiment. He then decided to leave the army, and we settled in Edinburgh. So we had been in Aberdeen, then we settled in Edinburgh, and then moved to the country south of Edinburgh, near the hills. And I grew up with my mother talking about the ghost that she'd seen when she was a child. Her mother and her aunts had all had psychic abilities. We basically had a psychic family lineage, which was just accepted. It was quite normal. In the country around me, so the big house had a grey lady ghost and had a goblin whore, as it was called. My dad, if there was a field drain blocked, he would get his twisted coat hangers out and go and find douse where the blockage was. It was just part and parcel of the culture. The Scottish culture is very open to fair folk, to witchcraft, to, it's just there in the history, it's there in the land. People with the second sight, psychic families, it's there. So for me, when I got to UCL, that's University College London, to do psychology, and I discovered that there were these English people who didn't think that the psychic phenomena existed, I thought that they were mad. Like, they were blind people, and I was describing a sunset to them. And they had no idea what anything looked like because they were completely blind. And the fact that they then said that my experience of the sunset was ridiculous, that there was no such thing, was just like, how can you do this? However, I was very fortunate in my second year of my undergraduate degree, a postgraduate persuaded the department to let him do 2 lab classes in parapsychology. And I was hooked. And again, I was fortunate in that there was a professor there who was one of the leading researchers into subliminal perception at that time. That's Professor Norman Dixon. And he was willing to supervise my final year project into parapsychology. And he then supervised my Ph.D. So I had real good fortune in first of all, that postgraduate, and then this very open professor who was willing to let me go, basically, and let me do what interested me.
As far as I know, there's only one person with a PhD in parapsychology. That's Jeffrey Mishlove in the States, whereas in Britain there's maybe 50 people with parapsychology PhDs. Why do you think there's more openness to that study in the UK?
The openness is partly cultural, as we've talked about. In that Britain, we've still got our roots in the past. We've got our Stonehenges and our Avebury stone circles. We've got the traditions of the village wise woman, let's put it that way, to leave horrible labels out, or the Druids, or it's there in our culture. It's also there in our land. And I've spent a lot of time in the States, and my feeling is that the immigrants from Columbus onwards somehow have not rooted properly. It's not rooted in the land. Where I live here in Glastonbury, the local hill, the Tor, we know that Gwyn ap Neath, who is the lord of the Welsh underworld, Annwn, has his castle there. And the entrance to the Welsh underworld, Annwn, is there, where you cross the Red River and the White River. Now, there's a hill, but we've got a mythology around that hill. We've got spirit around that hill. That hill's not just a hill, it's deep in its mythology and its history, and linking with Arthur and linking with Joseph of Arimathea, and so on and so forth. So the British culture, whilst in terms of academia and establishment, there's still the negative towards the psychic, which came from the witch burnings and the Inquisition and that 400 years where people were in fear of their life for being psychic. Still, you can't kill the spirit. The spirit is there in the land. I'm deeply rooted in the land. And because I've got the roots in the land, so it can emerge, so it can be permissible. But part of the fact we've got so many PhD students in Britain was due to Bob Morris. So Arthur Koestler left £1 million to set up a chair in parapsychology. Edinburgh University took that. We've got the chair there, the Koestler chair. And Bob Morris, who was American, came over from Syracuse University to take that chair, take that post. And he spent all of his time taking in PhD students and enabling people to get PhDs, and they then went out and got jobs as lecturers in the universities around Britain, and they've got their PhD students, and so it's happening. Without him doing that, we wouldn't be in quite as bad way as you are in the States. But, you know, when I started, there was Gertrude Schmeidler, who was at City University in New York. There were people at Princeton University, somebody at Yale, Irvin Child. There were actually quite a lot of parapsychologists in universities in America. But that was in the 70s. And that was during the psychedelic explosion era, when people were much more liberal. America has got a very strong puritanical founding father situation. And the Puritans were the ones who burnt the witches. The Puritans were the ones who really hated anything that smacked of the psychic. And that's why I think in America it's much more polarized and much harder for people to be open in the university establishment academic circles about their experiences and about their interest.
Very interesting. I think the only people that are really rooted are Native Americans, and they do have that kind of connection with nature and spirit, but their culture has been so decimated and barbarized by the dominant culture that it doesn't have, it's been weakened. Yes,
absolutely. And although what I would call the traditional native people, let's call them the Gaelic people, the Celtic peoples of Wales and Ireland and Scotland, they have been in many ways dominated by the English. I mean, the Scots were forbidden to speak their language, even, for instance, you know. I mean, huge repression. However, because they're still in their own land, and now there's a resurgence, yes, so they're getting to have their own parliaments and everything again. And you go to Scotland now, they're reforesting the Caledonian forest. They're taking the land back, and it feels like the spirit is returned. And it's wonderful to feel this rebirth of the spirit that's happening at the moment.
That's a note of positive in a world full of not so positive news. That's good. I'm asking everyone, what were your most difficult challenges and how did you cope? Because I think that's informative to our listeners and readers of any kind, not necessarily academic.
Because I was already thinking of being a parapsychologist. And the challenges within that. In terms of most difficult challenges, probably relationships, but let's leave that on one side. In terms of parapsychology, I had a very interesting one. As I said, I had the supervisor for my PhD, but I wasn't allowed to do my PhD in that university. Another university took me in. And a student of my supervisor was my official person within that university. But then he left. And the head of the department said that I either stopped doing parapsychology or I left the university. Fortunately, there was another professor in another university who already had 2 students doing PhDs in parapsychology who was willing to take me on.
Who was that, may I ask?
His name was Professor Lee at Surrey University. And he already had Ernesto Spinelli and Susan Blackmore doing PhDs with him. So that meant that I had to move university. And at the same time, because of my daughter, I was moving here to Glastonbury so she could have a school that wasn't in a city. So then I had to do my PhD at home, hundreds of miles away from the university where I was now enrolled. It took me 10 years to do my PhD. 10 years. I mean, it was a real challenge. At one point, it felt like I was holding on by a thread, a spider thread. But fortunately, a spider thread is the strongest material that we've ever encountered. So it just held me in there. And I managed to get through. But it really was a close one, That was a serious challenge.
And were you meditating at the time? to help you?
When I started to do my Ph.D. in parapsychology, that was when I started to practice yoga. So I had 2 to 3 years of classes in London before I came down to Glastonbury. And when I came to Glastonbury, there wasn't anyone teaching yoga to the level that I had become accustomed. So what I did was I started teaching yoga myself so that I would have people to help me keep my practice going. And that was how I managed to keep on. But, I was still very new at it, very young at it. And my research has told me, and my experience has told me, you need 15, 20 years of practice before you start to realize the benefits from it. In terms of the yogasanas, yes, the body will feel the benefits quite quickly. But in terms of the emotions and the mind, the prana and the meditation, that takes much longer. So I was going through quite a lot of growing during all that period.
Right. What was the title of your dissertation?
Comparison of subliminal and psychic perception.
Can you
to the best of my memory.
Give us an abstract of what you found?
Yes, very interesting, because subliminal perception is something that happens to everyone all the time. So it's like at the moment you're listening to me, but you can probably hear other sounds around you. But unless you stop focusing on me, you won't necessarily consciously hear those other sounds. Yeah, and so at the subliminal level, there's thousands of perceptions coming in all the time, but we're not consciously aware of them. However, we can do techniques like the Ganzfeld technique, or dreaming, or relaxing, or visualization, and those impressions will come through to consciousness. So there's a way of becoming aware at the subliminal level. So what I did was I had people in the Ganzfeld, where their eyes are covered with a translucent screen. They've got headphones on. I had a waterfall noise for them. And on half the sessions, there would be words coming through to their headphones that they couldn't hear because they were masked by the waterfall. And half of the sessions, they would be unplugged from what was then a tape recorder in those days, and the sender in another room would be consciously listening to those words and trying to send them through. Yeah. So the person in the session didn't know whether it was subliminal or psychic, because all they heard was the waterfall. They talked out their imagery. At the end, they got given, it was five lots of words. And they had to say which one they thought it was. They had to rank and rate it. And what I found was that people who were able to pick up on the subliminal information were the ones who picked up on the psychic information. So one is either aware at both subliminal and psychic levels, or one is defensive and blocked at both subliminal and psychic levels. So it's a generalized awareness. You're either sensitive to what, let's call it dream material, or the unconscious, very subtle, that still quiet voice that you really got to listen out for, or you're very blocked and defensive to that.
And were you able to predict with personality scales who would be open and who would be blocked?
Well, I tried all sorts of different personality stuff, and none of it came out strong and clear.
How interesting. Huh.
And that's actually what has been found in general, apart from belief. That's the one thing that's come out again and again and again. That was Gertrude Schmeidler, who first looked at belief back in the late 40s, early 50s. And it's the one predictor that has been consistent over all these years, that if you believe that you can be psychic under the test conditions, if you have had psychic experiences as a child, if you have experienced other people being psychic within the culture around you, yes, the more general level, then you are more likely to score well in test situations. Mm-hmm. And that's why I was saying I think culture is the most important thing, because that's like part of belief.
Got it.
Your attitude. In my talks, I always say your attitude is the most important action you can take. If I think I'm going to win the tennis match, I'm more likely to win the tennis match than if I think I won't. That's really simple, isn't it?
Yes.
And it's there at every single level in our lives. If we've got an attitude of I can, then you can. If you've got an attitude of I can't, then you can't. And so people saying there's no such thing as the psychic have already stopped themselves from experiencing it. And they will block other people around them by the force of their negation. And I think that the Western culture is blocking this experience around the world, because Western culture is now dominant around the whole world. And you will find that cultures that become westernized start to become skeptical about the psychic.
Interesting. Susan Blackmore was one of your peers in the Ph.D. program, and she's kind of famous as a skeptic. Do you have any insights into how one goes from a parapsychology PhD to skepticism?
Because I'm a really good friend of Susan's, I'd rather not talk about this.
Okay. All right. That's fair enough. What led you to your various books? Let's talk about because I'm so eager to get to it. The book about the Faery Faith. What did you find about that? What I know is mostly in terms of Findhorn Garden and the working with the nature spirits, the devas. I don't think they work with fairies. So what can you tell us about that culture?
Okay, so my book, The Faery Faith, came out of a chapter in my first book, Where Science and Magic Meet. And while I was writing Where Science and Magic Meet, I was reading Evans Wentz, The Faery Faith in Celtic Countries. And I recommend everybody who's interested in this topic, they should read that book. I consider it is the best book about this topic that anybody could possibly read. So that is number one. So that's where it came from. So my book, Where Science and Magic Meet, was out. It was a bestseller. I was invited to talks and workshops all around Britain and Europe and America and so on. And again and again and again, I was asked, would I please expand on the Faery Faith chapter? And that's where the Faery Faith book came from. In that expansion, I took a lot of material from Evans Wentz, and I called it The Faery Faith in homage to Evans Wentz, because I consider that his work is so important. And what I noticed in his work is that there's 4 strands to the legends and the myths. So there's one that you've already mentioned, the elementals or the devas. And this is the sort of the elemental forces within earth, water, air and fire. The second strand is what I would call the poltergeistery type stuff. So poltergeist literally means noisy spirit. Mm-hmm. And traditionally in Britain, in the crofts and the cottages, is that if you left the house in disarray, the local spirit would get very upset, and then you'd get the poltergeist type phenomena happening. Oh. So that's where you've got the local nature spirit interacting with the human and being part of the morality of the human, so to speak. The third level is what one might call, where is it, the third or the fourth? I can't remember. Doesn't matter. I'll go on to the deity aspect. And these were the Neolithic people who built the stone circles. And when the Celtic peoples moved into these lands, about 1800 BC, the Bronze Age, and then about 700-800 BC, the Iron Age, they found these amazing sacred places that had been built, and they deified the peoples. And so you get what I would call the Celtic deities of Manan and Maclear and Gwynab Neath and Ceridwen and Rhiannon and so on. And stories were told. And then you've got the next level aspect, which is where the people of the fair folk, the shining ones, the people that are like the deity aspect, are also the ancestors who married in with the human people or the Iron Age people. And so a lot of the Scottish families claim their lineage to be from one of the fair folk. So an example is Skye, and there's the MacLeods of Dunvegan being their sort of their castle stronghold, and they have what they call a fairy banner, because one of the chiefs of Dunvegan married a fairy woman. She gave him a son. She then disappeared back, and saying that, you know, if this banner was ever raised, that the fairy hordes would come to the aid of the clan of the MacLeods. So that's where you get the second sight lineages coming down. And in fact, in the witch burning times, all of the witches of Scotland who were tried said that they had their psychic abilities because they had connections with the fair folk. So this is where you get this human otherworld linkage going on. So we've got these 4 different aspects of tradition, which are in many ways interlinked, but the modern New Age fairy renaissance that's happening is actually in no way really connected with the deep cultural tradition of the Celtic peoples.
So the fairy folk that are small, like elves and dwarfs and fairies with wings, those aren't the fair people because they're small. They couldn't intermix with humans.
So you got that wrong automatically.
Okay, thank you.
The elvish people are of human height.
Ah.
And if you go to Lord of the Rings, you'll find that the dwarfish people are of human height as well. Your tiny little thing is a Victorian romance.
Oh, interesting. Aha. So in the elementals in our gardens, aren't they tiny?
So elemental, you're talking something that is not, certainly doesn't look human. Elemental is a tidal wave. Elemental is a volcano. Elemental is a huge force of nature. Elemental is the spirit within the old oak tree. Elemental is the tinkling of the bubbling spring. Elemental is the hush of the wind as it blows through the pine trees. You're connecting with the spirit of nature when you're connecting with elemental. And to put a human form on it is ridiculous.
It's limiting. So at Findhorn Garden, when they worked with the Deva of the cabbage or the rat Deva or something, please don't come to this part of the garden, they were working with the elementals?
Findhorn is so new age that I really would rather not talk about it. There was a particular person in Findhorn who was very connected in with the spirit of the land. His name was Rock, and he's been written out of history, which is quite sad. But he was the one with the green fingers and green thumbs, and he was the connection with spirit in that place. And yes, we're talking about connecting with the spirit of nature. That this is an animist philosophy. An animist philosophy says that everything has spirit. That we aren't just dealing with the physical. You're not just dealing with cabbage to be boiled and eaten. You're dealing with the energy that is within that living being. And once you connect with the whole of the planet as a living spirit with its own aspect of consciousness, then you start to relate to the world in a very different way. And we would be less destructive of this beautiful planet if we could once again connect and relate with nature in this form.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of fairy folk, how do they exist today?
Let's just say, like the rest of the planet, there's a mass extinction happening. I heard on the radio yesterday that one sentient life form, being, species, goes extinct every single hour. That's the extinction rate at this moment in time. When we're talking about this aspect of reality, okay, as I've said, it's omnipresent, it's Pachamama, it's everywhere. However, nature loves being wild, and the cities make it hard, and pouring pesticides on the ground makes it hard, and the shocking things that are happening with the mining and the quarrying and the plastics, and this planet is having a really, 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 really tough time. Of course life will go on. The planet is bigger than what us parasitic humans, the destruction that we can create to her. She's got a really bad fever. Our parasitism is life-threatening, but she will be bigger than us, which means that the spirit will carry on. But most people who think they're connecting with fair folk are connecting with creatures of their own imagination.
I remember reading books where people said they had conversations with fairies they said the fairy said this and I said this. So you think that's mostly their imagination?
90%.
I just want to say as a footnote, I think what gives me some joy is the young people, the teenagers who are striking from school to call attention to the need to pay attention to the climate change. So I know it's happening in the UK, it's happening in over 100 countries. The students are saying we won't put up with this anymore. Do you feel encouraged by the young people's taking a stand?
We took a stand back in the 70s. We took a big stand back in the 70s. Some of us changed our lifestyles. It's been beyond hope and despair, basically. I knew that we had gone too far in the 90s when no change had been made. We are in the midst of the largest mass extinction that this planet has ever known.
They call it the
We are
sixth.
gone. George Bernard Shaw said that hope is a delicious meal for breakfast and it's poison for supper. We've supper. And we're now going to have to live through, us and our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren are going to experience crisis, trauma and crisis. It's already started.
Yes.
The news today about Malawi and Zimbabwe and the huge typhoon, whatever it is, that's hit them, and the mass flooding, and that is, they were talking, it's connected with climate change.
Of course.
There's going to be more and more and more and more of that. And what they were saying is, with all these species going extinct, is they're the ones that have very small habitat ranges. The animals that are omnivorous and can survive in any habitat will survive best, which means humans and rats will end up ruling the world with not much else.
Cockroaches.
Oh, cockroaches. They're pretty good at it too. Yeah. Humans, rats and cockroaches. We're in good company, eh?
Oh my goodness. Yes. to change the subject, I'm really interested in what you found about the pineal gland and psi phenomena, because in my training at with the Berkeley Psychic Institute tools, they said the pineal gland is the root of clairvoyant ability. So I wondered if there's evidence for that other than just their belief.
Okay, yes. So this was the center point of my book, Where Science and Magic Meet. So during the Ganzfeld, I was working with altered states of consciousness. And whilst I was just in my first year doing my Ph.D, and all I had at that point was a proposal, I got flown out to America by McDonnell Douglas himself, who gave some money to the Parapsychology Association for aspiring students to be able to attend the conference in St. Louis.
Wait, my cat wants to say hello.
You're a lovely tabby. You're not even looking at me.
No. She says, I want to get down. Sorry. So St. Louis.
So I got given enough money to fly to and from the States. But I was a fairly impoverished postgraduate student. And being an Aries, I arrived in Chicago airport one day early, got on the Greyhound, arrived in St. Louis, went to the campus thinking that there'd be students around and I'd find somebody's floor that I could sleep on. And it was all locked. I hadn't realised in America campuses closed in the summer because students go off to work to earn the money. So I wandered around for an hour or two, and finally, behind some bushes and down some steps, I found an open door. Because I didn't want to sleep out in the middle of an American city.
No.
And in there was a small cafe and half a dozen postgraduate students. So I got a coffee, sat myself down, said, "Excuse me, could anybody put me up for the night?" And this gorgeous young man with hair down to his waist said, "Sure." So I went and met him and his lovely wife, who was a potter. And he was doing postgraduate research into psychoactive plants.
Oh.
And he had a garden and a greenhouse full of every psychoactive plant you could wish to imbibe. And he'd just come back from staying with the Shuar people and recording their traditions around ayahuasca.
Is that in Peru?
Yes. And in those days, ayahuasca was unheard of, apart from William Burroughs and his book about Yahe. This is back in the late 70s. But he then, I told him I'm doing parapsychology, he said, he had read a book by somebody called Claudio Naranjo, who had worked with ayahuasca and who considered that the sacred vine, which made the Hamala alkaloids, was the key thing and was what took one into what he considered to be the collective unconscious state of consciousness. And that this was maybe connected with a chemical found in the brain. And he thought perhaps this chemical was made or connected in some way with the pineal gland. And I went, because by that time I was starting to practice my yoga. And my yoga teacher had written a book about the pineal gland being Agya chakra, the third eye, the psychic center of the chakra system.
Yeah.
So here I had two bits of information. And I came back very excited because I'm working in altered states of consciousness, and here seems to be an altered state of consciousness. There's also a book by an anthropologist who had worked with people who took ayahuasca, who had talked about their clairvoyant and precognitive experiences. And the shamanic healing experiences with it. So very much to do with the psychic. So I had all those bits of information together, and I had a friend who was actually working with me as one of the participants in my research, who was studying for his PhD neurochemistry at a hospital in London. And he started scouring the literature for me. So we're talking pre-internet days. And almost pre-computer days in terms of personal laptops, but certainly pre-internet. And every time he found something to do with the pineal gland, he would give that bit of information to me. And I started to build up a picture at the neurochemical level, the anthropological level, of what was going on. And by 1981, they had isolated a chemical from the pineal gland, which they called pinoline, which was chemically identical with the Hamala alkaloids of the sacred vine of ayahuasca.
Wow. How interesting.
So the yogic teaching that the pineal gland is the psychic center now had a neurochemical basis for it. And what we've discovered since then is that the pineal gland is where you get the greatest concentration of serotonin.
Oh.
What the pinoline does is it stops the serotonin from breaking down, so that the serotonin, which is 5-HT, hydroxytryptamine, goes into an unstable state, makes various other forms of tryptamine, one of which is DMT, dimethoxytryptamine, which is a highly potent hallucinogen. So we all have DMT, a class A drug, in our brains every night of our lives. And the thought is that this is the natural trigger for dreaming.
Oh.
Parapsychology, we have found that spontaneous psychic experiences occur most commonly in the dreaming, sleeping state. So what we found in parapsychology, the most conducive environment for psychic experience is the sleep dream state, is perhaps connected with the fact that in the brain we're creating DMT at night, which is connected with the pinoline made in the pineal gland. So although we haven't got every step of the way yet absolutely tied down as this really happens, we've got a really good hypothesis going.
Is the DMT created in the pineal gland as well as the pinealin?
Well, it's found in the brain and it's also found in the gut, funnily enough.
Oh.
So think of your gut tuition. Why do we have DMT in the gut? However, there's lots of research going on into DMT at the moment. You might have come across Rick Strassman's book. So he's a medic in the States who's got permission to do research with DMT. And now somebody in Britain has finally got Home Office permission to do research with DMT. So because the suggestion is that it helps with depression. So research, because in the 70s, you know, after Timothy Leary and all research with psychoactive substances was banned. Well, now, bit by bit, they're allowing research with psychoactive substances again. So watch this space, basically. You know, we haven't got all the bits of the puzzle, but we have got enough bits to make a good hypothesis.
How is DMT made outside of the body? I mean, is there a particular herb that has that? Does ayahuasca have DMT?
Okay. So ayahuasca is made from a mix of the sacred vine, Banisteriopsis carpi, and depending on which tribe is making it, because it's made right through the Amazon area, so there used to be hundreds of different tribes, although they're going extinct at quite a rate as well. But they all used a different herb mixed with the sacred vine, but this herb would contain DMT. So Psychotria viridis is one of them. Nixime carpi is another one. So it's various different herbs that contain DMT. However, the problem is that if you ingest just the herb, it gets passed out through the body. It won't be assimilated. The gut refuses to assimilate it. But if you ingest that herb together with the sacred vine, the Hamala alkaloids, that enables the DMT to be assimilated into the bloodstream and up to the brain to give the psychoactive effects. So that's why the sacred vine is used by all the tribes. All of them use the sacred vine, which is why it's the sacred vine. But there will be various different. So there's another one that contains the Hamala alkaloids called Syrian Root, Beganum Hamala, and that is used throughout the Middle East. It's not the DMT, but being Beganum Hamala maybe it interacts with the serotonin in the same way that the pinealine does for us to endogenously create our own DMT. We don't quite know why Syrian Root is considered to be a psychoactive substance, but that's a possibility.
Mm-hmm. So does this suggest that if someone is like an exceptional remote viewer or great on Ganzfield, that their pineal gland might be operating in a different way than someone who's not?
I don't know. But what I do know is that we don't need to take ayahuasca and be violently sick. The yogic tradition says that the Agya chakra, the psychic center, can be affected by meditation. We can affect all of the functioning of our body through meditation. We can affect our hormones. We can affect our emotional state. We can affect our mental state. And I would like any researchers who want to work with people who are very experienced with meditation and see whether there is a change in their blood chemistry which maybe would corroborate these ideas that I'm talking about. In other words, we can affect the functioning of our pineal gland, of our hormonal state, so that we are creating these psychoactive substances that seem to be conducive for psychic experiences. And I also think that the sacred sites of Britain and around the world are places that affect us at this level to shift us into a more psi-conducive state of consciousness. And that is the link with the Earth's magnetic field. And that was my latest research, was working with meditators and looking at the effect of the Earth's magnetic field on our psychic awareness. And I found that the people who were most sensitive to changes in geomagnetic field were the people whose psychic awareness was most strongly correlated with changes in the Earth's magnetic field. So we've got this, that's another subliminal perception, that's another area where we are either open to that effect or closed to it, like all subliminal perceptions. So some people don't seem to be affected by changes in the Earth's magnetic field. Other people are very sensitive to those changes. The people who are most sensitive to those changes show a strong correlation between their psychic awareness and what is going on with the Earth's magnetic field. Stone circles and other sacred sites are places where you get strong changes in magnetic field. And the pineal gland is exquisitely sensitive to changes in the Earth's magnetic field. So maybe its functioning is being affected. Maybe. This is, again, we're now going way speculative. Before I gave a hypothesis where we've got enough bits of the puzzle that we're maybe beginning to discover something, I'm now going way speculative. But if we think of the sacred sites, these are places where traditionally they're connected with the fair folk, traditionally they're connected with witchcraft, traditionally they're connected with druids, traditionally they're connected with magic. And I'm suggesting that the Neolithic people who built them were scientists at the psychic level, and they were creating structures that would enhance our psychic awareness. And that maybe the whole pineal gland hypothesis, DMT, altered states of consciousness hypothesis, is in some way connected. That's what I'm saying.
Glastonbury is famous for its being a center with ley lines and energy centers in Glastonbury, right?
Yeah.
And what do you feel when you're in one of those charged centers in your town, in your city?
Okay, so Glastonbury is a town, and the psychic hotspot is well, basically all of it, but it's the Tor, which I've already talked about as being this high hill that is thought to be the castle of Gwynab Neath, who is the lord of the Welsh underworld, Annwn, and the entrance to the underworld is through the Tor. It's also got the sacred waters of the White Spring and Chalice Well, which are the red and the white rivers that you have to cross when you go into Annwn, the Welsh underworld. It's also got Chalice Hill, and the abbey where Joseph of Arimathea was supposed to have founded the first Christian church is at the foot of Chalice Hill. So the whole town is a really potent, pokey place. And all the land as well, all around, because the town is only part of the Isle of Avalon. And people who come here tend to have very strong experiences. So when I was doing my parapsychology classes, I'd always do a questionnaire asking people about the experiences that they'd had. And it's what I would call a place of very intense spiritual development. It's not really ideal as a place to have relationships and grow children. It's more a place where one should be focused strongly on your own personal self-development. And that's very good for some people, and some people thrive. Let's say it's full of very potent bullshit, and good manure helps growth. But because it's so intense, a lot of people can be very disturbed. And you get a lot of people with mental breakdown, a lot of people that have very traumatic experiences. So a lot of people get spun out of it. But on the other hand, for those people for whom it's good, there's that incredible creativity. You know, the place is awash with musicians, with artists, with craftspeople, theatre, you name it. And when I was in the States and people would ask me what Glastonbury was like, I would say, well, if you roll up California into one small market town, then you've got Glastonbury.
And you started a Psi research center there. Is it still ongoing?
No, I've retired now.
Mm-hmm. So what are you focusing on now? Tell us about your work with the organic farm healer.
Oh, well, that was before I went to India. That was great fun.
Oh.
So it came out of one of my parapsychology classes, and I did advanced classes where we would spend the 2 terms just on 2 or 3 topics. And this year, one of the people in the class was a healer herself, a very, very, very good distant healer. I recommend her to everyone. And she asked if we could work with somebody who was a bit of a name as a healer in town, if he would work with us. So I got in touch with him, and at the time he said no, so we dropped that project. But a couple of years later, he approached me and he said he would like to do research with me. So I knew that he was known for germinating seeds in his hands. And there'd already been research in parapsychology looking at healers holding water. The water would then be poured on the seeds, and they would grow faster, germinate better than seeds that had just ordinary water poured on them. So I suggested to him, why didn't we scale up this research and work with an organic farm to see if we could get the seed growing bigger and better and healthier? Because the difference between organic and chemical farming is only 10% in terms of profitability. So if organic seed could be enhanced by 10%, that would mean that organic farming would be as profitable as chemical farming. Now, we're very fortunate here, and in the local market we have an organic vegetable stall. So I went to the vegetable stall and I said, would they be interested? So they took it back to the farm, and at their weekly meeting, they suggested the project, and the farm went for it. So what we did was I went with the healer to the farm. The grower gave us 2 pots. They gave us a pot of completely unopened seed. Yes, so the pot was unsealed. Somebody would open it and would put 100 seeds into each of 4 pots and would label them A, B, C, D. The healer would then be given one of the pots. No, they weren't labelled at that point. They would just be the 4 pots, unlabelled. Healer would be given 1 pot. A mimic healer, who was a person who actually managed the farm but said that she did not have green fingers in any way. She worked with the animals. She had another pot, and then 2 pots would be put to one side so that they were controls, completely untouched. The healer would hold his hands, not touching the pot, but just around it. And the mimic would do identical. When he was done, we would all leave apart from that one person who would then, at random, label the pots A, B, C, D. And only that person knew which pot was which. And they would leave and would never go back to the farm again, so that it was completely double blind. That meant that there were 4 pots left on the table, and the grower would come in after we'd all gone, and he would collect the 4 pots. He wouldn't know which one was by the healer, which by the mimic, which were the 2 controls, completely double blind. He took the 4 pots, he sowed the seed so that you had a tray of A, a tray of B, a tray of C, a tray of D. They would all be treated absolutely equally, watered. I had a photographer who would come, take photographs of them every week. We would count how many germinated in each tray, according to each, and so on. How many grew. They would then be planted out in row A, B, C, D. But row A would have a row to one side of it, so that it would be within the middle, and row D also, so that they were all middle rows. There'd be 6 rows. A row on either, so that every lettuce had identical conditions to every other lettuce. Yes? None of them was an outside one. They were all inside lettuces, so to speak. Then when we came to harvest them, A, B, C, D, all the 4 rows would be harvested at the same time. And I would go in with a team of people, and they would cut them flat on the ground. So we got the whole lettuce. We would weigh the whole lettuce. We would then turn it upside down and rate it according to fungal disease and slug damage.
Oh.
We'd then cut off any of the bad leaves that had, fungal damage or slug, weigh it again, net weight, and that was then packed in bags to go to be sold. We did this 3 years running. 2 different healers, 2 different farms, 3 different. And each time there would be 8, because you sow lettuces every 2 weeks, we would get 6 to 8 sowings. So we'd get 6 to 8 trials in each year. So we're talking thousands of lettuces, thousands. And year after year after year, the lettuces that had been, where the seed had been blessed by the healer, had greater growth. They were significantly larger in their net weight than the ones that hadn't been blessed by the healer. They suffered as much slug damage. The difference was significantly less fungal damage. Significantly less lettuce had to be cut off to allow the net weight to be bigger. So that meant that a healer blessing the seed before it goes out will enable organic crops to be that much bigger and better.
Was there a difference between the sham healer and the ones that didn't get any human attention?
No, there was no difference between the different controls. The only difference was with the seed blessed by the healer.
Well, that's profound, because
Yeah.
if 10% improvement in organic. But do you think people can be taught to be healers?
Okay, let me give you a violin, and let me teach you how to play the violin. After a while, the cat might stop screaming, but I doubt whether you'll ever be Yehudi Menuhin.
No.
We all have talent.
Yes.
We all have ability. My eldest daughter is a top mathematician. She has got that sort of mind that does maths. Not everybody has green fingers. Some people have green fingers and are really good gardeners. Other people are really good with animals. We all have our talents and our abilities. Some people are healers.
Mm-hmm. But
everybody could probably learn a little bit. Like you could learn the violin to the point where it's bearable for others around you.
Right.
But not everybody is going to be a genius at it.
Right. But I'm just thinking practically in terms of if this technique, which is so impactful, was to spread, people would have to be maybe taught how to enhance their, we say green thumb, to enhance their green fingerness.
Well, that's meditation.
Mm.
That's what I've discovered, is that working with meditation, so you learn to work with your mind and work with your prana, or however you want to understand the life force. And again, there are individual differences, and some people are better and some people are not so good, and that is always going to be the way of it.
Right.
Each of us have our own talents.
Right.
But you only need to have one healer in the community to go and bless all the crops.
Yeah.
And traditionally in Britain, when it was a Catholic country, the Catholic priests used to walk around the crop fields and sprinkle holy water over the crops. And that holy water was a bit like the healer healing the water that was then poured over the seeds, and the seeds then grow better. Do you see what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
Just the holy water can maybe make the difference. So we've got traditional methods in there. When I was in Ladakh, they were frightened that there was going to be locusts eating all their crops coming through from Tibet. Mm. So they had a Rinpoche come to do ritual with a fire, and the ash was then spread around their fields to protect their crops from the invading locusts. So every culture, traditional culture, has ways of protecting crops from harm and enhancing the crops. Mm-hmm. And maybe this is what was going on at Findhorn, was that Rock had very green fingers, and so things grew very well for him.
Uh-huh. You have 2 daughters?
Yes.
And are either of them interested in psi phenomena?
Well, they grew up with it, so they know it's around. As I said, my eldest daughter's a mathematician, but she's certainly not close-minded in any way. And my younger daughter is an artist and has 2 children and works at a city farm. So she's working with plants, yes.
Oh, good.
Very sensitive.
Well, I hope she'll do the healing work with the plants.
Who knows?
Okay. Finishing up here, what are future directions in your research? What are you interested in now?
I've retired.
Well, that doesn't mean that you're not thinking and reading and doing projects.
Yes, it does.
Really? Oh, how interesting.
I'm enjoying growing my own food and being involved in community and my grandchildren.
Ah, got it. Through Mother Earth. Some people say that psi phenomena can be explained by quantum physics with entanglement and non-local effects of entangled particles. Does that make any sense to you?
That's chapter 2 in my book.
And what's the conclusion of that chapter?
Well, I was very taken with the work of David Bohm. And when I was studying with the Tibetans, the Tibetan Buddhist philosophy, particularly that of Nagarjuna, is basically saying very similar things to what David Bohm was saying. And Kashmiri Shaivism, which was being taught at the ashram, is another philosophy that is saying very similar things to what David Bohm was saying. So I do see that there is a link between Buddhism, quantum physics, and psychic theory of how it actually works. I think that although we haven't yet got to the final definitive theoretical understanding, that we're definitely on the right path there.
And does it have to do with consciousness being primary rather than material?
Nagarjuna and Kashmiri Shaivism and Tibetan Buddhist Mahayana philosophy all say that both mind and matter, both consciousness and energy, it's a both and philosophy, that they are two sides of the same thing, that they are not separate in any way. That to go to monistic, to go to dualistic is actually to miss the point that we are talking about two sides of the same coin, that we cannot have one without the other. And in fact, there's some that have it as a three-way thing, which is what Bohm ended up with. And he ended up with particle, wave, and meaning was how he envisaged it. And I've just been reading the Dhammapada, the Buddhist philosophy, and they also have a three-way thing in that one. But Kashmiri Shaivism and the Nagarjuna philosophy of Tibetan Buddhism have it as a two-way, that it's consciousness energy, or you can maybe even see it as consciousness vibration, but that all form, all matter, all the universe comes essentially out of this yab-yum. You'll see the yab-yum statues where you've got the two together, the male and the female, the divinity and the consort. Anyway, it's this fusion of consciousness energy that out of which is primary within the whole universe. So we're not saying one is primary or the other is primary. It's the two together. They're two sides of the same.
I'm just thinking like Shiva Shakti. A lot of times, indigenous people say that Mother was first. Mother gave birth to the universe. So it suggests there is some kind of chicken and the egg happening. So I just read an interesting article that said before the Big Bang, there was something else. So I always thought the Big Bang was the beginning of everything, but it's not, and that there's probably multi-universes.
Yes, well, that's the latest thinking now, is that black holes are basically birthing other universes.
Oh.
Which is a very interesting one, and we're talking eternity here. The Western world has a beginning, a middle, and an end, but the Eastern world has the circle, where it's all beginning, middle, end. It's eternity. It's always infinite, always, 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 just changing, but all is beginning, all is middle, all is end. It's not a linear thing, it's a circular understanding. And we have, in the beginning was a bang, and I found really interesting somebody called Mathieu Ricard, who wrote a book called The Quantum and the Lotus, and he's a Western scientist who became a Buddhist, and he's talking with a Buddhist Vietnamese man who became a physicist. And in Buddhism, they have the concept of sunyata, or what we call emptiness, which is like the nothingness before the bang, but what the best way for us to translate that word is infinite potential. Behind, but this is Bohm in his implicate order, behind this see-touch world of form in which we live is infinite potential. Everything is there, everything. Eternity, infinity, the whole universe, everything in potential. And it's this infinite potential that is where the Shiva Shakti is in its subtlest form. And the Shiva Shakti, as it comes through the various different levels of subtleness to this gross form that we're living in.
Mm-hmm.
So when people talk about emptiness, actually what they're talking about is the infinite potential of the formless behind this world of form.
And that was what was before the Big Bang.
For me, that this philosophy that I came across in the ashram and with the Tibetans, and both of them talking the same philosophy, which I found really interesting, is also the philosophy that David Bohm was talking about. So whether it's quantum physics itself, or whether it's string theory, or whether it's M theory, or whatever, when we go to the subtlest aspect of the physical, we come through, like the worm Ouroboros, to the spiritual. And there they unite. The physical and the spiritual unite at this level.
The snake with its tail in its mouth.
That's right, yes.
Wow. Is there anything else that we haven't talked about that you think would be good to include? That we thought, we didn't talk about whatever.
You asked me, one of your questions was a visionary scientist to recommend. And I would suggest Jack Hunter. He is doing an online journal called Paranthropology. And it's the union of parapsychology and anthropology. And if you remember, I talked about that I think that culture is this big one that we really need to be going into. And this is what he is doing. And he's got a Facebook page, Paranthropology. Various books come out as well. And there's fascinating stuff. People working in Taiwan, people working in Singapore with all of the deities and the divinities. And it really is, I think, that he's doing wonderful work. I think really brilliant. Go for Jack Hunter.
Is he British?
Yes. He works at, I think he's at Lampeter University, but I might have got that wrong.
Okay. I'll look for him. If I don't find him, I'll ask you to help me.
Oh, just Google Paranthropology.
Okay.
And you'll come across it on the website.
Yeah. Okay. Terrific.